we will see some 345 million people acutely hungry. And that includes the 50 million people who are on the verge of famine.
战争、病毒、经济的通胀、饥荒和气候的灾难，我们会看到人类正在面临着二战以来最大的一场危机。
The United Nations has warned that time is running out to tackle climate change.
We don't need any more empty promises. We are tired of their blah, blah, blah.
Unless we do major changing of how we treat wildlife, if we don't change, then it's almost certain, right, there will be more outbreaks.
These are structural insecurities that we now face globally. Geopolitical, economic, existential, climate and pandemics together. And they're coupled with an underlying sense of social unease, a loss of trust, a loss of optimism within societies. That's happened globally.
What we're seeing is a perfect storm. To approach the world as we have for the last 3+ decades, that's no longer possible. It's a completely different ballgame now.
The worst drought in 4 decades is killing people across the Horn of Africa. The World Food Programme estimates that up to 20 million people in Kenya, Ethiopia and Somalia could face starvation by the end of the year. Awilio Hassan had to make the painful decision to leave some of her children behind when she left her village in search of food.
ilaa waa dhalay 4 abaarta iyo 8 iyo nool 4 uu ku jirnaagsaday mid kaana rafaad uu soo rooray ilmay baadiye jiraan abaara ka dhacday beero la tacbineen beerina abaar waay.
Many of the children here in the refugee camp show signs of kwashiorkor, a form of malnutrition caused by a severe protein deficiency. So far, hundreds have already died.
واسبدل aad weyn ay ka muuqato dadka imaanayo barnaamijyada kale waxay ugu duwan tahay qaybta jiifka dadka imaanayo ma ku xirno magaalada Muqdisho kaliya bal waxa badan number aad u badan oo ka imaanayo gobolada.
Drought comes and goes in the Horn of Africa, but this is one like no other. An example of the extreme weather patterns that climate change is bringing. Hunger is quickly turning into anger. Leaders in Somalia warn that the terrorist group Al-Shabaab is gaining ground.
It's not just about, okay, food prices are going up, so this one kind of young man decides to join Al-Shabaab. It's food prices go up. So my family had to leave our house. We abandoned whatever kind of income generation activity or wage employment that we had. We're living in a camp where I don't have access to education. I went through a period in my youth where I was getting very bad nutrition. Nobody was investing in me. And also I have a complete lack of trust in the government. Now, 10 years later, it doesn't go away. I mean, this kid that's been underinvested for that period in his life and has the lack of trust in the government. Now, what's going to happen to the country in the long term with a whole generation of kids who grew up in that situation?
The impending food crisis is not only confined to Africa. The Ukraine war has sent a major shock to the global food system. Russia and Ukraine together produce 30% of the world's wheat supply, 28% of the world's corn exports, and more than half of the world's sunflower seed oil, which is used to make vegetable oil. Together, they used to export 1/8 of the food traded worldwide. Then there are fertilizers. The UN says Russia is the world's #1 exporter of nitrogen fertilizer and #2 in phosphorus and potassium fertilizers.
There's food security, there's energy security, and now there's fertilizer security. Fertilizer for industrial scale agriculture requires nitrogen, it requires ammonia, and these are actually linked to natural gas, right? So the growing of a crop, somewhere in the world is linked to actual natural gas production in a place like Russia.
On top of the geopolitical shock, there's climate change. In March, a record-shattering heat wave in India reduced wheat yields. Temperatures exceeded more than 45 degrees Celsius. It was the hottest month in India since records began in 1901.
The month of March is very important because that's the time when the filling of the grain takes place. When you don't get the right temperature and then the temperature suddenly zoomed, so it caused shriveling of the grains, and of course the yield dropped because of the shriveling. This year the drop, there are various estimates being floating around, and some say that the drop would be 10 million ton less, and some say the drop would be almost equal to half the target that we had set.
In late May, usually a time for summer parties in Brazil, people in Rio de Janeiro were instead left freezing. The snow threatened coffee, sugarcane, and orange crops with frost, and sent international prices for coffee and sugar higher. Then in June, floods in Bangladesh and India left millions of homes underwater and destroyed vast expanses of agriculture.
আজকে আমরা সিরামুড়ি দিছি এনে সাহায্য এখন অবস্থা আছে আমরা এখানে ও নিচে তালাত আছি এখন আমার গোর আন্যাও গাছের আঘাত লাগকে বুঝাছে ও তো দেখা যায় গোর ও গাছের আঘাত আছে আমার গোর আর এর বাদে কালকে তো আরো 2 বিপদ গেল নাতিনো সহতা ডুবিয়া সব পানি তোলে গেছ লাগি তার সাংবাদিক হলেও তারাও তুবাইছে আরো মানুষ তুবাইয়া দিছিল সেনাবাহিনীর মানুষও আছেন সবে তুবাইতা বাইয়া দিছিল আমার আল্লাহ কেউ মরছে না প্রতিটা বাচ্চা হচ্ছে আছে তারারে আল্লাহ বাঁচাইয়া রাখছে।
Stunning pictures this morning out of Yellowstone. The Yellowstone River is at its highest elevation in more than 100 years. Unprecedented rainfall causing heavy flooding and rock slides in the park.
Fires have been raging in European countries, sweltering under a heat wave and drought.
Shanghai is switching off the lights along its famous Bund riverfront. Now, officials say that it's a move to save electricity as a nationwide heat wave sends demand for power soaring.
Well, being outdoors here in Chongqing, it feels like I'm standing in front of a heated oven with its door open. I was out filming with my cameraman yesterday, and just within 2 hours, our equipment overheated and his phone had temporarily shut off. So we had to find shade to cool our equipment down. And behind me, you can see it's quite dark now, so maybe you can't see, but there are huge plumes of smoke that seem to be stretching for kilometers. This fire had been burning since 5 p.m. on Sunday. More than 24 hours later, it's still raging on.
Devastating floods in Pakistan. Aid flights begin arriving in response to pleas for help as the country struggles with a climate catastrophe that is now also a $10 billion economic disaster.
Well, the United Nations has warned that time is running out to tackle climate change. The World Meteorological Organization's latest report says humanity must drastically cut its greenhouse gas emissions to avoid a catastrophe.
It should be obvious that we cannot solve a crisis with the same methods that got us into it in the first place. What will it take for the people in power to wake up? We don't need any more distant, non-binding pledges. We don't need any more empty promises. We are tired of their blah, blah, blah. Our leaders are not leading. This is what leadership looks like.
Climate change, COVID-19, the war in Ukraine. Each factor reinforces the other, resulting in a perfect storm.
we will see some 345 million people acutely hungry, a 25% increase by the end of 2022. And that includes the 50 million people that they're also projecting who live across 45 countries who are on the verge of famine.
In the case of Africa, as people's access to food diminishes, access to living, essentially, the basics of living, diminish, then of course the tendency is to leave and to seek a better place, right? In this case, with Africa, it's usually Europe. So that means it's an immigration crisis for the more developed countries in the north. So the food crisis will result in definitely an immigration crisis, but it will also, of course, result in potentially failed states, instability, and uprisings.
Well, I think what we're facing is not a series of freak events. When you look at all the troubles we're facing, when you look at the troubles we're facing geopolitically, in food and energy prices, in climate extremities, the water crisis, when you look at them all together, and when you look at what's happening within societies, the loss of trust and optimism, increased polarization in many cases, these are all the result of slow-moving changes, a slow burn that eventually sparks off a major conflict, a major crisis, major suffering. So we have to appreciate that we are in a situation of structural insecurity, not just episodes, bad luck, or bad actors. This is structural. It's going to be with us for a while. And that's why it's not just a temporary storm, it's a long storm. And it's a perfect long storm because we're talking about how each of these threats, each of these dangers reinforces the other. Each rebounds on the other. The geopolitical tensions we face, the conflicts we face, make it very hard to address the world's most pressing challenges. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, the water crisis, and ensuring, of course, peace and stability itself. The challenge of climate change and water security itself is going to rebound on geopolitical stability.
现在看来，像斯里兰卡接下来还有像中美洲的一些国家、南美洲的一些国家、非洲的一些国家都会出现因为粮食危机出现的社会动荡然后再接着这个政府的崩盘，政府失灵无政府状态在各个国家正在蔓延，所以这种情况下呢，对人类的文明的发展是一次巨大的冲击。
People in Arab countries have always eaten bread. In Egypt, bread is known as aish, meaning life. And so when grain prices spiked in 2007, Egypt's bread prices rose almost 40%. Unemployment was also going up, and when the government did not address the issue of hunger, anger erupted in the streets. Egypt's annual food price inflation continued through the Arab Spring and had hit 18.9% before President Mubarak was overthrown.
11 years ago, the government's failure to manage the prices becomes kind of a symptom of the general inability of the government to manage the social contract, to just have good operations. And so there's a lot of distrust in the government. You can't even manage to keep the prices of bread for the people, and this is what you promised.
Many similar stories played out across the Middle East. Food insecurity intermingled with complicated political and religious factors. toppling governments, fueling extremism, and impacting millions of people. The turmoil in Syria had been the longest and bloodiest of any of the Arab Spring uprisings. What started in March 2011 with a handful of street protests descended into a full-blown civil war that left hundreds of thousands of people dead. Stretching from 2006 to 2010, Syria was hit by what was recorded as the worst multi-year drought in around 900 years. The devastation of agricultural land caused 800,000 people to lose their incomes. 85% of the country's livestock died. 1.5 million rural workers headed to the cities to find work. Around the same time, President Bashar Assad decided to reduce fuel, water, and food subsidies. Anger erupted.
In Syria, there was a particular increase in food insecurity during that period before the Arab Spring, linked to production failures in grains. The food insecurity and poverty led to more rural-urban migration, and that put increased pressure on the cities, which is where the Arab Spring kind of protests started. Again, I think it's best to think about this not necessarily as this was the primary cause, but it became part of the underlying sense of dissatisfaction with the government's ability to maintain the social contract.
By 2014, the terrorist group ISIS emerged. At one time, it controlled a third of Syria.
Where ISIS takes over, life changes. This organisation has a history of abducting and killing doctors, academics and journalists.
With cities reduced to rubble, 6.6 million people inside Syria were displaced, and more than 5 million people were forced to flee.
The Mediterranean Sea hasn't always been so kind to those sailing it. It buried many in the past days.
French police have begun clearing out thousands of refugees in Paris. They're being taken to temporary shelters just outside the city.
يعني فوق بعض مقعود نوم غير سواتهم وما ابو شيء لا عندنا مصاري نشتري خيام ولا عندنا شيء نصرف على حالنا واحنا 12 عيله نطلع شيء 60 70 بني ادم بو 15 كبار والبقيه كلياتهم لل10 سنين وتحت لا مأوى ولا شغله ولا عمله.
Drought, food insecurity, poverty, poor governance, geopolitics. It all makes the tinder in the box more readily excitable.
The World Bank's estimated by 2030, about 2/3 of the world's extreme poor are going to be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. These are the states that do not have the institutional capacity to have a social safety net. So yes, this is the place where the global community needs to step in.
I think this requires concerted multilateral, regional, and national action. Countries do have to mobilize revenues better, more effectively, reduce leakages from the systems, but mobilize revenues. Every country has to do that. And in the developing world, this is now accepted. But the world has to be part of this act of reinvesting. The world has to take an interest, first for humanitarian reasons, second because if we don't take an interest and the world doesn't support health, education, and human security, the whole world will be affected. And it'll make it impossible to address challenges like climate change. And the multilateral institutions, together with the regional institutions, are best suited for that. Everyone has to play their part. You can't just carry on with ad hoc bilateral actions, ad hoc philanthropic support. You need systematic multilateral support, and it can be done. These are not unaffordable problems.
战争、病毒、经济的通胀、饥荒和气候的灾难。那么这5大灾难呢，实际上同时在1年之内爆发，是罕见的，人类历史上几乎没有出现过。那么2022年，的上半年，明显出现了5难并行的这样的这个我们过去没有想到过的灾难。那我觉得情况正在变坏也是因为粮食危机正在转变为债务危机，并且转变为社会的动荡。
COVID-19. All of us are familiar with the pain it has caused. Though scientists haven't been able to pinpoint exactly how it happened, they are in agreement that it's a zoonotic disease, meaning it can spread between people and animals. And we are living in a time when zoonotic diseases are emerging globally at an unprecedented rate. COVID-19 is one example. Others include Ebola, SARS, and more recently, monkeypox. Contagion happens when humans interact with animals directly or through consumption of animal products. Many scientists study bats as they are carriers of the coronavirus.
In terms of the number of coronavirus that bats carries, nobody knows. I think that currently we have at least 1,000 different coronavirus already discovered, and that most people thinking what we discover is 1% of what's really in the nature. Yeah, so that's many, many more.
Dr. Wang and his team are studying the bats to understand why they carry so many viruses and the lessons that could be applied to human health. He stresses that bats are not the bad guys. They make up 1/4 of all mammal species and are essential for pollination and controlling disease-carrying insects like mosquitoes.
Bats have been on Earth much, much longer than humans. So we were the latecomers, they were the natives, right? So they have been around for at least 65 million years,
It's humans that are causing the spillover of viruses. Deforestation is driving displaced species of animals, from bats to monkeys to mosquitoes, into new areas. Human interaction with animals increases as people move deeper into forests, or when traffickers move wildlife into cities.
If you go by the last 20 years and you look towards the next 20 years, unless we do major changing of how we treat wildlife, how we do farming, how we travel, how we transport, if we don't change, then it's almost certain, right, there will be more outbreaks.
COVID has clearly demonstrated how biodiversity is important to us human beings, but also for the well-being of the planet. Because of expansive agricultural land, habitat destruction, deforestation, all have caused the human population to move closer to the wild areas or the animal kingdom, and we have interfered with their peace. As the result, the pathogens which are not harmful to the animals but harmful to human beings got transmitted to humans. So basically, each individual has a role to play to change our actions. Is it our eating habits? Is it our consumption, our production? All these have to change.
Forests are one of the most important solutions to addressing the effects of climate change. Approximately 2.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide, 1/3 of the CO2 released from burning fossil fuels, is absorbed by forests every year. Preserving them also prevents further risks of future zoonotic diseases. With climate change displacing millions and COVID-19 affecting billions, have we learnt our lesson?
The world's rainforests are disappearing at an alarming rate as the COVID-19 situation continues to evolve.
The Amazon rainforest is burning at an alarming rate. Thousands of square meters of rainforest have been razed due to man-made fires.
In the Amazon forest, the effects of man-made fires are clear to see.
So this is one of the main differences that you're going to see between a burned forest and an unburned forest. You can see that we're not seeing many trees, many big, thick trees that we associate with the Amazon. Just all very thin, fast-growing species.
The rainforest is so called because it's such a wet place where the trees pull up water from the earth that then gathers in the atmosphere to become rain. That balance is being destroyed by deforestation, which leads to more forest fires and higher global temperatures. Experts warn that at this rate of deforestation, soon the water cycle will become irreversibly broken, locking in a trend of declining rainfall and longer dry seasons.
If we were to deforest the whole of the Amazon basin that comprises 9 countries, all the emissions that would arise from deforestation would be equivalent of 100 years of the US fossil fuel emissions. That's how much carbon the Amazon stores. Unfortunately, I think that within my lifetime, if there's no political will, if we don't take strong positions, the Amazon is going to be gone.
Brazil's President Bolsonaro supports the exploitation of the forest. Under his leadership, deforestation in Brazil is hitting record levels. And as farms expand into the rainforest, researchers say new pandemics may emerge. Displaced species, from bats to rats to mosquitoes, are increasing the chances of a virulent virus, bacteria or fungus jumping species. Scientists have identified about 220 different types of viruses in the Amazon, 37 of which can cause diseases in humans, and 15 of which have the potential to cause epidemics.
The Amazon deforestation conundrum has been with us now for decades. And there have been various solutions proposed. One, of course, is where the world community actually pays Brazil to not cut down trees. But that's just not working. It hasn't worked. It's been proposed. How do you control something like that? How do you control criminal behavior in these criminal gangs that are mining illegally, that are cutting trees down illegally? And that's a very difficult thing to do. We have a very asymmetric relationship between the so-called industrialized North and the emerging economies of the South. Now, if the emerging economies are going to decarbonize and they're going to essentially forego short-term fossil fuel-driven economic gains, they're going to need some help to do that.
2022年呢，很有可能将是人类有气温记录以来的最热的一年。中国现在这个好多地都已经40多度了，欧洲都已经出现了这个46度，甚至某些地方出现这么大的高温。所以类似这样的一个五难并行的应该说这种灾难性的这个人类文明发展的进程的出现啊，是非常非常令我们感到惊恐。那么这就更加要求发达国家、欧美国家更加负起作为发达国家的责任。这也要求全球呢进一步的团结，去克制这个五难并行往更糟糕的方向去发展的这种趋势。
We have to redouble efforts to develop clean energies. It requires more investment. It requires substantially more investment. So by most calculations, it requires something like $3 trillion of investment each year in order to reach net zero, as well as to address the needs of climate change adaptation, helping countries adapt to climate change. That's a large sum of money, but it's not at all unachievable, because each year global capital markets grow by roughly that sum or more. So we have to mobilize private finance. Public finance has to be a catalytic instrument. So you can't finance this just from public finances. You've got to mobilize private finance, and we've got to use not just our market institutions, but use the multilateral institutions to mobilize private finance. It can be done. And we in Singapore are playing our part to help to develop these markets, to help develop the partnerships, so that you have what's called blended finance, where public and private finance, and sometimes philanthropic finance, comes together.
As the North-South decarbonisation debate continues, forests in many places continue to shrink. Scientists warn that a recurring pandemic is a matter of time. In June, it was announced that $1.2 billion was pledged to the G20 to help prepare for future pandemics. The fund will go to things like procuring vaccines and drugs for lower to middle income countries.
Wherever we are in the world, we have to invest in what's called global public goods. Global public goods in healthcare, in the climate, in water security, even in economic development generally. Every country has to be part of that game, because every country is going to be affected if we fail in one part of the world. So the pandemic is a very clear illustration of that. Multilateralism is critical, not just because it helps it helps humanity have better lives in different parts of the world, but because it rebounds on every other population.
So you wake up in the morning and your social media feed is full with bad news. It doesn't have to be that way. There are tremendous opportunities that just need somebody to take a first step. We are living today in a day and age where we have more knowledge than we have ever had before. I grew up in a food business. Agriculture, food has been part of my extended family. We were basically farming dairy cows, cattle, pigs, converting them to lovely sausages. I studied agriculture and later on food sciences, and I moved on across the globe to develop my professional career, among which was the UK, a stint in Russia. I started my own business in India, took it to China, sold it, exited from the business, came over to Singapore.
Decades in the food industry convinced Chris that there was something deeply problematic about the food production system.
What has been achieved since the end of the Second World War is a gigantic industry that today focuses on only a sort of a dozen major crops and 5 animals to feed the vast majority of the human race. Up to 75% of food comes from these 12 crops, as well as just these 5 animals. And I believe firmly that the core foundation of today's problems, be it environmental degradation and pollution, degradation of soils, carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, as well as water footprints, they're all related to this concentrated belief system that we can feed the population healthily on these few crops and few animals. The opposite is true, because as a human race, we basically came out of the woods about 10, 15,000 years ago. We're still hunting and gathering and feeding ourselves on 350 different species on an annual basis. Our diets are diverse by default, but we have narrowed our food intake down to just these few crops.
Scientists searching for solutions to degraded soil have identified legumes as having the potential to regenerate soil. And it was this that gave Chris the idea to start a new company.
Bambara groundnut was introduced to me by a professor who used to run the Crops for the Future Center in KL. It grows with very, very little water. It grows on very poor soils. It has fantastic benefits for human consumption.
With this knowledge, Chris and his team went to Africa to look for farmers who grow this crop. But what they found was barren land.
Topsoil is basically taken away, so the sand is left.
It doesn't even crumble. It falls into dust. It's like hard like a rock.
So typically, if you go and touch soil, right, and if you open up soil and you look at it,
just dust.
There should be a lot of life in there.
So what that means is there's no organic matter in it.
Ideally, you see the earthworm. You should see, you should mold coming. You should see life being in there. And I felt like, my heart is breaking because this is not soil anymore. These farming communities today in that part of the world, in the savannah, have a tremendous job to make something grow on this, particularly if they are asked to grow the current crops for them to produce that for the market. Because these soils have very, very little production capacity. There's no life in it.
But the Bambara nut can grow here. It can even regenerate the soil.
It has that ability because it makes an extremely elaborate root system. And with this long and elaborate root system, the Bambara has that ability to actually reach out into the nitty-gritty corners of the soil that it is presented with, to then grab onto moisture and start bringing life about.
The Bambara nut, in its original form, is not widely eaten. But that's where the food scientists come in. Chris and his team have turned the nuts into one of the most consumed foods, and that's instant noodles. The team has also turned the Bambara nut into a milk product. Today, the company is selling the milk and instant noodles to the US, Europe, Japan, and other parts of Asia.
Famines are setting people in motion. They become refugees. Today we call them climate change refugees. And what we even heard from the government of Ghana is that they are busy trying to make meaningful livelihoods back up in the north. What we do is we bring a new market for this forgotten crop they call the Bambara groundnut. They can then use that to actually prepare and restore the land around them. On top of them, we partner with the Pond Foundation in Switzerland, who then helps us to bring foundational needs to these communities. And I'm talking about basic infrastructure, basic health care, as well as bring learning materials into the schools for children. I wish that young entrepreneurs start thinking through multiple layers. Take one forgotten crop, underutilized crop, and develop a value chain, develop wonderful products out of it. Do it in a way that the P&L looks good. Don't do it for charity, of course not, because the aspect of a regenerative economy needs to be taken into consideration. But think through the layers right down to the arable land today and how these arable lands today shall feed 2 generations from now.
We need to diversify our food system. The reality is that today, 60% of all of the calories that we consume are rice, wheat, corn, and soy. And our ability to provide for a more affordable and nutritious diet and a diet that has a less impact on our climate will require us to diversify. We need to ensure that we make available more drought-resistant and drought-tolerant seeds.
Across the globe, people have found solutions to produce food and address climate change. Scaling such projects is more urgent than ever.
走。均匀一点。
Underneath these waters is a former coal mine. Now, its solar panels generate 150 megawatt of electricity a year, or the equivalent of about 53,000 tons of coal. It spans 800,000 square meters. That's the size of about 110 football fields. Considering this used to be a coal mine, it's a prime example of how the world's dirtiest energy could undergo a green conversion. The floating solar farm also has a segment specially dedicated to fish farms. The panels have been installed on poles and at a specific angle as to allow enough sunlight to reach the waters. Fishermen here say their yields have actually gone up after installation of the solar panels.
一亩能达到500斤，反正5倍嘛，就投资大一点，但是效益超过5倍。
田有多少产量？
以前每亩大概只有100斤左右。
The dual use of farming and solar here in this project is a first in China.
管桩之间的东西走向的这个距离是5米，南北走向的距离是6.2米。这种设计，根据我们投喂的专门渔业设施方面的研究，这种设计啊，它对水面的照射率啊，正好符合鱼类的生长。
Scientists say these solar cells are up to 10 times more efficient than solar cells installed on roads, as the water helps to keep the cells cool.
因为水面它整体这个水温是比较恒定，就确保我这个组件这个温度也有一种恒定。当这个组件在一个恒定的温度状态，我这个组件的转化效率也是最高的，每天这个发电量也可以达到最佳。还有最重要的一个特点啊。 比如山地电站、沙漠电站，它的这种地势一般是不平整的。但是我们水上光伏电站，大家可以看到，我们16个方阵，所有的组件都可以确保在同一个角度都是28度。
This is the future, generating electricity without discharging any emissions. Solar farms like this are increasingly being adopted across the world. And China has plans to export similar projects along the Green Silk Road.
那么，所谓绿色丝绸之路呢，就是通过中国的绿色的投资这个环保的合作以及低碳发展的这种合作，共同的使得这些国家不仅仅是能够出现这个经济的共同的增长，而且是低碳的高质量的增长。那么这里面具体落实的政策呢，我觉得大概有这么几点。第一呢，就是中国在推进绿色丝绸之路建设中呢，中国已经承诺不再投资和扩建煤电项目，使得这些国家未来依靠于能源不再依靠于破坏环境、挖掘煤炭出现的能源依赖。
The task for global leadership, in the next decade forward, is greater than it's ever been. Globalization as we've known it for the past 3+ decades is over, and we're going to have to live with a world that is now focused more on regionalization and localization. That's not necessarily an entirely bad thing. Tackling climate change, tackling water scarcity, food insecurity, and even energy, in many ways, can be tackled successfully on a localized and a regionalized level. And we're just going to have to see more of that.
The multipolar world makes multilateral cooperation more challenging in some ways. It's so different from the way it was 75 or more years ago. You had the formation of the Bretton Woods institutions and, of course, the United Nations. The IMF, the World Bank, at that time, GATT, which later became the WTO. Critical institutions that held the world together for a long period of time. But that was a unipolar world. The world was coming out of war. The US was by far the global superpower, and it shaped these institutions together with its partners and its allies, and it worked for a period of time. It was a unipolar world and one emerging from war. We're now in a very different situation. We're not emerging from war, we're entering a perfect long storm. And we are in a multipolar world. But there's a new basis for optimism, which is that unlike the past, 75 years ago, the concept of the global commons didn't exist. Climate change, pandemics, those weren't on people's minds at all, weren't on the leaders' minds at all. Now we have a realization that the central challenge facing all nations have to do with the global commons. Climate change, pandemic security, water security, and other challenges of the global commons, including the challenges coming out of reduced biodiversity, that itself makes the spread of diseases much easier. It means that every nation now has a self-interest in acting collectively with other nations to address these challenges. So this reorientation in multilateralism is possible. And it is possible because every country will have to realize it's in its self-interest. And it's in the self-interest of the US, China, the European Union, and of course the developing world to collaborate now on solutions.